Baby discovered a bear cub locked in a fire station equipment room, what he did next was bold. The old fire station sat on the edge of Millbrook, where the town slowly gave way to endless stretches of pine forest. It was one of those autumn evenings when the air carried a crisp chill that made everything feel sharper, clearer somehow. Ethan Marshall had just finished checking the equipment for the third time that day, a habit he'd developed over his 15 years as a firefighter. The station was quiet, almost too quiet, with most of the crew out on a routine call about a cat stuck in a tree on Maple Street. Ethan stayed behind with his 7-year-old son Jacob, who loved spending time at the station whenever his mother worked late at the hospital. The boy would sit cross-legged on the worn leather couch in the break room, flipping through old firefighting magazines or drawing pictures of fire trucks with remarkable detail for someone his age. Something felt different that evening, though. Ethan couldn't quite place it, but there was an odd quality to the silence, like the building itself was holding its breath. He noticed it first when he was wiping down the chrome on Engine 4. The usual creaks and groans of the old building seemed muffled, and even the fluorescent lights hummed at a lower frequency than normal. Jacob noticed it too, looking up from his coloring book with those wide brown eyes that reminded Ethan so much of his late father. "Dad, do you hear that?" the boy asked, tilting his head like a curious puppy. Ethan stopped polishing and listened. At first there was nothing, just the distant sound of traffic on Main Street and the wind rustling through the oak trees outside. Then he heard it, a soft scratching sound, barely audible, coming from somewhere deeper in the station. The equipment room was supposed to be locked. It had been locked when Ethan checked it an hour ago, and he had the only key on his belt. Yet, as they approached the heavy metal door, both father and son could hear something moving inside. Not the random settling of gear or the occasional drip from old pipes, but deliberate movement, accompanied by what sounded like soft whimpering. Ethan's hand went instinctively to his radio, ready to call for backup if needed, but Jacob grabbed his sleeve. "Wait, Dad, it sounds scared," the boy whispered, pressing his ear against the cold metal door. The scratching stopped immediately, as if whatever was inside had heard them too. They stood there for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, breathing in sync, waiting for another sound. When Ethan finally turned the key and pushed open the heavy door, the sight that greeted them defied all logic. There, huddled between a stack of oxygen tanks and a shelf of helmets, was a small bear cub. Not more than 4 months old by the look of it, with fur so dark it seemed to absorb the fluorescent light. Its eyes, wide with fear, reflected like amber jewels in the harsh lighting. The cub couldn't have weighed more than 20 pounds, and it was trembling, pressed as far back into the corner as it could manage. Ethan's first instinct was to pull Jacob back, to slam the door and call animal control immediately. Bears, even small ones, were wild animals, unpredictable and potentially dangerous. But Jacob had already taken a step forward, his small hand extended palm down in a gesture of peace that seemed far too mature for his years. "It's okay, little guy," Jacob said in the softest voice Ethan had ever heard him use. The cub's trembling slowed slightly, its nose twitching as it caught the boy's scent. There was something profoundly wrong with this picture, Ethan thought. How had a bear cub gotten into a locked room in the middle of a fire station? The windows were sealed, the ventilation grates too small, and the door had definitely been locked. More puzzling still was the cub's condition. It wasn't injured, at least not visibly, but there was something deliberate about its placement here, as if it had been carefully positioned rather than randomly wandering in. The cub made a small sound, not quite a growl, more like a questioning chirp. And Jacob responded by sitting down cross-legged on the concrete floor, still maintaining that remarkable calm that children sometimes possess in extraordinary situations. Ethan found himself frozen between his training, which told him to remove his son from potential danger immediately, and a strange intuition that this situation required a different approach. The cub wasn't acting aggressively. If anything, it seemed almost relieved to see them, though that was probably just Ethan projecting human emotions onto an animal. Still, there was an intelligence in those amber eyes that made him pause. He'd seen plenty of wildlife in his years responding to calls in the rural parts of the county, but this was different. The cub's gaze held a quality of awareness, of purpose even, that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Not from fear, but from the recognition that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Jacob had started humming softly, a lullaby his grandmother used to sing, and incredibly the cub's eyes began to droop slightly. It shifted its weight, no longer pressed against the wall but settling into a more relaxed position. That's when Ethan noticed the marking on its left shoulder, a distinctive pattern in the fur that looked almost like a star. He'd seen that marking before, he was certain of it, but couldn't immediately place where. His mind raced through possibilities, each more improbable than the last. Had someone brought the cub here deliberately? But why? And how had they gotten past the security cameras without being noticed? He pulled out his phone to check the footage, but the app showed nothing unusual for the past 12 hours, just the regular comings and goings of the fire crew. The cub made another sound, this time clearly directed at Jacob, who had scooted a few inches closer. "He's hungry." "Dad," Jacob said with the certainty that only children possess. "Look at his tummy, it's all sunken in." Ethan had to admit the boy was right. The cub did look underfed, though not starved. More like it had missed a few meals recently. Against every protocol he'd ever learned, Ethan found himself considering what they might have in the station kitchen that a bear cub could eat. There was leftover salmon from lunch, some berries that Connor had brought in from his garden, even some honey that Haley kept for her tea. But feeding a wild animal was dangerous, creating dependencies and removing natural fear that kept both animals and humans safe. Yet something about this situation felt different from any wildlife encounter he'd experienced. The cub wasn't here by accident. He was becoming more certain of that with each passing moment. Someone or something had placed it here, specifically here, in a locked room that only he had access to. The thought should have been alarming, but instead it filled him with a strange sense of purpose, as if he was part of something larger than he could understand. Jacob had pulled a granola bar from his pocket, the kind with real blueberries that his mother always packed for him, and was slowly unwrapping it. The cub's nose twitched more actively now, and it took a tentative step forward, then another. "Slowly, Jake," Ethan heard himself saying, though he couldn't believe he was allowing this to happen. His son broke off a small piece of the granola bar and placed it on the floor between them. The cub approached with a mixture of caution and desperation that tugged at something deep in Ethan's chest. It sniffed the offering thoroughly before delicately picking it up with its teeth, barely making contact with the floor. The way it ate, careful and almost grateful, reminded Ethan of the stray dog his family had taken in when he was Jacob's age. That dog had become his best friend for 12 wonderful years. But this was a bear, a wild animal that belonged in the forest, not in a fire station making friends with his 7-year-old son. The radio on Ethan's belt crackled to life, making all three of them jump. "Station 19, this is Engine 2. We're heading back. ETA 15 minutes. It was Captain Brooks' voice, and Ethan knew he had to make a decision quickly. Protocol demanded he report this immediately, call animal control, have the cub removed and relocated far from human habitation. But looking at his son, who was now sharing the last of his granola bar with a wild bear cub like they were old friends, Ethan hesitated. There was something pure and important happening here, something that bureaucracy and protocol would destroy without understanding. The cub had finished eating and was now sitting barely 2 feet from Jacob, its breathing calm and steady. "Dad, look," Jacob whispered, pointing to the cub's neck. There, partially hidden by thick fur, was something that looked like a collar. Not a tracking collar like researchers used, but something else. Something that appeared to be made of woven plant material, almost like the friendship bracelets Jacob made at summer camp. Ethan knelt down slowly, telegraphing his movements so as not to startle the animal. The cub watched him, but didn't retreat. Up close, Ethan could see the collar was indeed handmade, intricately woven with a pattern that seemed both random and deliberate. Attached to it was a small wooden charm, no bigger than a quarter, with symbols carved into it that Ethan didn't recognize. This changed everything. This wasn't just a lost cub that had somehow wandered into their station. This was something else entirely. Something that challenged everything Ethan thought he knew about the boundaries between the human and natural worlds. The cub suddenly stood and walked to the door, looking back at them expectantly. It wanted them to follow. Jacob was already on his feet, ready for an adventure, but Ethan grabbed his shoulder gently. They couldn't just follow a bear cub into the night, could they? Yet the intelligence in those amber eyes, the purposeful way it waited by the door, suggested this was more than random animal behavior. The sound of the fire engine pulling into the bay forced Ethan's hand. In minutes, the station would be full of firefighters, and the cub's fate would be out of his hands. Making a decision that went against every regulation he'd sworn to uphold, Ethan quickly ushered the cub and Jacob out the back door of the equipment room, which led to a small fenced area where they stored spare hoses. The cub immediately headed for the fence, and to Ethan's amazement, squeezed through a gap that shouldn't have been large enough for it to fit through. It paused on the other side, looking back, clearly waiting for them to follow. "We have to help him, Dad," Jacob said, his voice carrying a conviction that seemed beyond his years. "He came here for a reason. He came to us." The emphasis on us wasn't lost on Ethan. Somehow, his son had grasped something that Ethan was only beginning to understand. This wasn't random. This was intentional. The cub had been placed in their care for a reason, and now it was leading them somewhere. Ethan could hear voices in the station now, his colleagues returning from their call. He had seconds to decide whether to follow protocol or follow his instincts. Looking at his son's determined face and the patient cub waiting just beyond the fence, Ethan made his choice. He lifted Jacob over the fence, then climbed over himself, his firefighter's fitness making it easy despite the height. The cub immediately started walking toward the tree line, not running but moving with purpose. It would pause every few yards, looking back to ensure they were following. The October evening was growing darker, and Ethan pulled out his flashlight, though he kept it pointed at the ground to avoid startling their unusual guide. The cub seemed to know exactly where it was going, following a path through the underbrush that Ethan couldn't see but that obviously existed. They walked for perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt longer in the gathering darkness. Jacob stayed close to his father but showed no fear, only curiosity and something else, a kind of recognition, as if he understood something fundamental about what was happening that Ethan was still struggling to grasp. The forest around them was quiet, unusually so. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just their footsteps and breathing. Even the ever-present autumn breeze had stilled. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The cub led them to a small clearing where an ancient oak tree stood, its trunk so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't encircle it. At the base of the tree was a hollow, and beside it, barely visible in the fading light, was another bear. But this was no ordinary bear. Even from a distance, Ethan could see it was massive, easily 400 pounds, with fur that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The cub ran to it immediately, and the larger bear, clearly its mother, nuzzled it gently. But her eyes never left Ethan and Jacob. There was an intelligence there that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. This wasn't the blank stare of a wild animal. This was something else, something that suggested understanding, communication even. Jacob took a step forward, and Ethan almost grabbed him back, but something in the mother bear's posture stopped him. She wasn't threatening. If anything, she seemed relieved. The cub was making small sounds, almost like it was talking, and impossibly, the mother seemed to be listening, occasionally making soft sounds in response. Then she did something that defied every nature documentary Ethan had ever watched. She approached them slowly, carefully, and when she was about 6 feet away, she sat down. Just sat there, looking at them with those impossibly intelligent eyes. That's when Ethan noticed her front paw. It was injured, swollen to nearly twice its normal size, with what looked like porcupine quills embedded deep in the pad. The wound was infected, that much was clear even in the dim light. She couldn't hunt, couldn't provide for her cub, and somehow, impossibly, she had known to bring her baby to the one place where humans might help. Not just any humans, but specifically to them. The thought was absurd, but looking at the scene before him, Ethan couldn't deny what he was seeing. This mother had somehow gotten her cub into a locked room in their fire station, knowing that they would find it, knowing that they would help. "She needs help, Dad," Jacob said quietly, stating the obvious with the simple clarity of a child. "That's why she sent him to us. She knew we would come." Ethan's mind raced. He had basic first aid training for animals, had even helped injured wildlife before, but this was different. This was a fully grown black bear with an infected wound. One wrong move and she could kill them both with a single swipe of her good paw. But looking at her, at the way she sat so still, so patient, he knew she understood the situation as well as he did. She was putting her trust in them, had put her baby's life in their hands to bring them here. Ethan pulled out his phone, surprised to find he had signal this deep in the forest. He could call for help, get a wildlife vet out here, follow proper procedures. But something told him that would break whatever fragile trust had been established. The mother bear seemed to sense his hesitation. She slowly, deliberately, extended her injured paw toward them, the movement clearly causing her pain. It was an unmistakable gesture of trust, of request for help. Jacob had already pulled off his small backpack and was rummaging through it. He pulled out a water bottle and the small first aid kit his mother always insisted he carry. "We can help her," Jacob said with that same strange confidence. "I know we can." Ethan looked at his son, at the determined set of his small jaw, and realized that somehow his 7-year-old understood this situation better than he did. Children hadn't yet learned all the boundaries that adults erected between themselves and the natural world. To Jacob, this was simple. A mother needed help, so they would help. The fact that the mother was a bear seemed almost incidental to him. Ethan made his decision. Moving slowly, telegraphing every movement, he approached the injured bear. She remained perfectly still as he knelt beside her injured paw. Up close, he could see the damage was worse than he'd thought. At least a dozen quills were embedded deep in the pad, and the swelling suggested infection had set in days ago. Without treatment, she would likely lose the paw or die from blood poisoning. The cub had curled up against its mother's side, watching with those same intelligent amber eyes. Ethan pulled on the latex gloves from Jacob's first aid kit, absurdly small on his large hands, but better than nothing. The mother bear watched him, but made no aggressive moves, even when he gently took her massive paw in his hands. The first quill came out easily, followed by a small gush of pus and blood. The bear flinched but didn't pull away. If anything, she seemed to relax slightly, as if understanding that the pain was necessary for healing. Jacob had moved closer, holding the flashlight steady so Ethan could see what he was doing. One by one, Ethan removed the quills, each extraction bringing a small flinch from the massive animal, but no aggression. It was surreal, kneeling in a dark forest, performing first aid on a wild bear, while his 7-year-old son held a flashlight like they did this every day. When the last quill was removed, Ethan poured water from Jacob's bottle over the wound, washing away the pus and blood. The bear made a sound, not quite a growl, more like a sigh of relief. Jacob had found the small tube of antibiotic ointment in the kit and handed it to his father without being asked. Ethan applied it liberally, knowing it wasn't enough to cure the infection, but hoping it would help. He wished he had proper veterinary antibiotics, but this would have to do for now. The bear pulled her paw back slowly when he was done, examining his work with what seemed like curiosity. Then she did something that would stay with Ethan for the rest of his life. She touched her nose gently to Jacob's hand, then to Ethan's, a gesture so deliberately gentle, so obviously meaningful, that it brought tears to Ethan's eyes. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was a mother expressing gratitude for help with her child. The cub, as if understanding that the crisis had passed, began playing around its mother, occasionally running over to Jacob and bumping against his legs like a large, furry cat. They stayed in the clearing for another hour, though it felt like minutes. The mother bear dozed while the cub played with Jacob, who had found a stick and was playing a gentle game of tug-of-war with the small bear. Ethan watched in amazement as his son, who was sometimes shy around other children, played freely with a wild bear cub. Every so often, the mother would open one eye to check on her baby, but she seemed to trust them completely now. It was peaceful in a way that Ethan hadn't experienced in years, a perfect moment of connection between species that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. The spell was broken by Ethan's phone buzzing. It was a text from Captain Brooks. "Where are you? Everything okay?" Ethan realized they'd been gone for over an hour. He needed to get Jacob back before people started searching for them. As if understanding, the mother bear stood slowly, favoring her injured paw, but able to put some weight on it now that the quills were gone. She made a soft sound, and the cub immediately ran to her side. They began walking deeper into the forest, but stopped at the edge of the clearing. The mother looked back at them one last time, and in her eyes Ethan saw something that would haunt and inspire him for years to come: recognition, understanding, and yes, gratitude. The walk back to the station was quiet, both Ethan and Jacob lost in their own thoughts about what had just happened. When they reached the fence behind the station, Ethan could see lights on in the building, his colleagues probably wondering where he'd gone. He lifted Jacob over the fence, then climbed over himself. They would need a story, something believable that didn't involve performing first aid on a wild bear. But as they walked toward the back door, Jacob slipped his small hand into Ethan's larger one and squeezed. "We did good, didn't we, Dad?" he asked. Ethan squeezed back, thinking of the mother bear's trusting eyes, the cub's playful nature, the impossible connection they'd just experienced. "Yeah, buddy," he said. "We did good." Inside the station, Captain Brooks was waiting, arms crossed, but more curious than angry. "Where have you two been? We've been looking everywhere for you." Ethan was about to make up some excuse about showing Jacob the trails behind the station when his son spoke up. "We were helping someone who needed it," Jacob said simply. "Someone who couldn't ask for help the normal way." Jessica Brooks looked at the boy, then at Ethan, and something in her expression softened. She'd been a firefighter for 20 years, and had developed an instinct for when something important had happened, even if she didn't understand what. "Everyone okay?" she asked, and Ethan nodded. "Everyone's okay now," he said, and meant it. She studied them for another moment, then shrugged. "Well, next time, maybe leave a note." Logan was about to organize a search party. She walked away, leaving Ethan and Jacob alone in the equipment room where it had all started. The room looked exactly as it had before. No sign that a bear cub had ever been there. If it weren't for the dirt on their clothes and the memory burned into their minds, Ethan might have thought they'd imagined the whole thing. Over the next few days, Ethan found himself thinking constantly about the encounter. He'd checked the local news for any reports of bear sightings, but there were none. He even drove out to the clearing one evening after work, but found no sign of the bears. It was as if they'd vanished into the forest, leaving no trace except the memory. Jacob seemed to accept this more easily than his father, occasionally mentioning their bear friends, but not dwelling on it. Children had a remarkable ability to accept the extraordinary and move on. About a week later, Ethan was doing his morning equipment check when he found something that made his heart skip. There, placed carefully on the driver's seat of Engine 4, was the wooden charm from the cub's collar. He picked it up with trembling hands, examining the carved symbols that still made no sense to him. But their meaning didn't matter. What mattered was that somehow the bears had come back, had left this token for them. He showed it to Jacob that evening, and his son's face lit up with joy. "They're okay, Dad. They came back to say thank you." Ethan had the charm made into a keychain, which he attached to his work keys. Every time he felt it in his pocket, he remembered that night, the trust in the mother bear's eyes, the joy in Jacob's face as he played with the cub. It reminded him that the world was bigger and more mysterious than most people realized. The connections could form across species in ways that defied logic, but felt absolutely right. Some of his colleagues noticed the charm and asked about it, but Ethan would just smile and say it was a good luck charm Jacob had made for him. In a way, that wasn't far from the truth. Months passed, and winter settled over Millbrook with its usual quiet blanket of snow. Ethan and Jacob never saw the bears again, though sometimes, walking in the woods behind the station, they would find tracks in the snow, always two sets, one large and one small. The tracks would circle the station, as if checking on them, before heading back into the deeper forest. Jacob would always insist on leaving a granola bar by the fence, and it would always be gone by morning. Whether taken by their bears or some other creature, they never knew, but Jacob remained convinced their friends were still out there, still okay. The following spring, Ethan was called to a cabin fire on the outskirts of town. It was a bad one, the old wooden structure fully engulfed by the time they arrived. The elderly man who lived there was safely outside, but he was frantic, pointing at the cabin and shouting about his cat still being inside. Ethan was suiting up to go in when movement at the forest's edge caught his eye. There, barely visible in the smoke and chaos, stood a large bear. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Ethan knew with absolute certainty that it was her. She disappeared back into the trees as quickly as she'd appeared, but somehow her presence gave him courage. He found the cat, terrified but unharmed, hiding under a cast-iron bathtub that had protected it from the worst of the heat and smoke. When he emerged with the animal, the old man wept with gratitude, clutching his pet like a lifeline. As Ethan helped pack up equipment after the fire was controlled, he looked again at the forest's edge. There was no sign of the bear, but he felt her presence, a guardian spirit watching over them. That night he told Jacob about the sighting, and his son nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense to him. "She's watching out for you, Dad, like you watched out for her." The story of the bear cub in the fire station became something of a legend in their family, told and retold at gatherings, each telling adding new details, new meanings. Jacob's mother, initially skeptical, came to believe when she saw the change in both her son and husband after that night. They were more open, more aware of the world around them, more willing to see magic in everyday moments. The wooden charm became a family talisman, passed between them when someone needed courage or a reminder that the world was full of mysteries worth protecting. Years later, when Jacob was preparing for college, studying to become a wildlife biologist, he would tell his father that the night with the bears had changed his life, had shown him his path. He wanted to understand the intelligence they'd witnessed, to protect the wild spaces where such connections were still possible. Ethan, now a captain himself, would squeeze his son's shoulder and hand him the wooden charm, now worn smooth from years of handling. "Keep it," he'd say. "Remember that night. Remember that sometimes the most important calls we answer aren't the ones that come through the radio." The fire station still stands on the edge of Millbrook, and the equipment room door still locks with the same key. New firefighters have come and gone, each bringing their own stories and experiences. But sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the station is nearly empty, someone will report hearing strange sounds from the equipment room. When they check, they find nothing unusual, just the neat rows of gear and supplies. But occasionally, very occasionally, they'll find something else. A single black bear hair caught on a helmet strap, or tiny claw marks on the concrete floor that weren't there before. Ethan never tried to explain what happened that night to anyone outside his family. How could he? How could he explain the intelligence in those amber eyes, the deliberate trust of a mother bear, the impossible appearance of a cub in a locked room? Some things, he learned, didn't need explaining. They just needed to be experienced, remembered, and cherished. The world was full of connections that science couldn't yet explain, bonds that formed across species and defied logic. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you got to be part of something extraordinary. The wooden charm still hangs from Ethan's keys, a constant reminder of that night. Sometimes, driving through town or responding to a call, he'll feel it in his pocket and smile. Somewhere out there, he knows, a bear and her cub are living their lives, hunting and playing and growing. They carry the memory of that night too, he's certain of it. The mother's paw healed cleanly, based on the tracks they occasionally found, showing no sign of a limp. The cub would be fully grown now, possibly with cubs of its own. The cycle of life continuing, enriched by one impossible night of connection. Looking back, Ethan realized that the most profound moments in life often came disguised as problems to be solved. The cub in the equipment room had seemed like a crisis, a disruption to the normal order of things, but it had turned out to be a gift, a doorway into a larger understanding of the world. Jacob had known this instinctively, approaching the situation with the open heart of a child. It had taken Ethan longer to understand, but when he did, it had changed him fundamentally. He became a better firefighter, more intuitive, more willing to trust his instincts even when they defied protocol. The story spread quietly through the firefighting community, never officially documented but passed along in quiet conversations during long shifts. Other firefighters reported similar experiences. Moments when wildlife seemed to seek them out deliberately, displaying trust that went beyond normal animal behavior. A network of understanding formed, unspoken but real, among those who'd experienced these connections. They became more protective of the wild spaces around their communities, more aware of their role as bridges between the human and natural worlds. Jacob did become a wildlife biologist, specializing in bear behavior and intelligence. His doctoral thesis on interspecies communication was groundbreaking, though he never mentioned the personal experience that had inspired it. He would often call his father from research sites, excited about new discoveries that seemed to confirm what they'd known that night, that animals, particularly bears, were far more intelligent and aware than most people realized. They had complex emotional lives, sophisticated communication systems, and yes, the ability to recognize and remember individual humans who had helped them. During one of these calls, Jacob told his father about observing a mother bear, teaching her cubs to avoid certain areas while deliberately approaching others. "She knew, Dad," he said, his voice full of wonder even after years of study. "She knew which humans were safe, which ones would help, and she was teaching her cubs the difference, just like our bear knew to come to us." Ethan had felt tears in his eyes, remembering the weight of that massive paw in his hands, the trust in those intelligent eyes. They had been chosen, he realized, selected by some instinct or intelligence that transcended species boundaries. The fire station eventually got new security cameras, digital locks, and all the modern equipment that 21st century firefighting demanded. But the equipment room remained largely unchanged, still secured with the old lock that Ethan had kept when everything else was upgraded. New firefighters would ask about it, wondering why this one room retained its old-fashioned security. Ethan would just smile and say it was tradition, that some things didn't need changing. But late at night, when he was alone in the station, he would sometimes stand in that room and remember. He would remember the sound that had drawn them there, the sight of the frightened cub huddled in the corner, Jacob's fearless compassion, the walk through the dark forest following their unlikely guide. Most of all, he would remember the moment of connection with the mother bear, when two different species had bridged an impossible gap through trust and need. It had been a reminder that humans weren't separate from nature but part of it, connected in ways that modern life often obscured but couldn't erase. The wooden charm eventually passed to Jacob's daughter, Ethan's granddaughter, who wore it on a necklace and seemed to have inherited her father's gift with animals. She would spend hours in the woods behind her grandfather's house, returning with stories of the creatures she'd encountered. Ethan would listen with a knowing smile, remembering his own son at that age, remembering a night when the impossible became real. She never questioned the stories her grandfather told her about the bears, accepting them with the same easy faith Jacob had shown that night. One autumn evening, nearly 20 years after the original encounter, Ethan was teaching his granddaughter to identify animal tracks in the soft earth near the tree line. She was 8, just a year older than Jacob had been that night. They were examining deer prints when she suddenly grabbed his hand, pointing excitedly at a large depression in the mud. It was a bear track, fresh, probably from the night before. But what made Ethan's heart race was the smaller track beside it, perfectly placed as if a cub had been walking alongside its mother. They followed the tracks for a while, his granddaughter chattering excitedly about bears and their habits, information she'd absorbed from her father's books and stories. The tracks led toward the fire station, circled it once, then headed back into the forest. Ethan knew it couldn't be the same bears. Too much time had passed. But perhaps it was their descendants still carrying some genetic or cultural memory of that night, still checking on the place where help had once been found. The thought filled him with a profound sense of continuity, of connections that spanned generations. That night, his granddaughter insisted on leaving a peanut butter sandwich by the fence for the bears, she said with serious determination. Ethan didn't have the heart to tell her it would more likely be taken by raccoons, but when they checked the next morning, the sandwich was gone, and in its place was a single perfect pine cone, the kind that grew only in the deepest parts of the forest. His granddaughter picked it up reverently, declaring it a gift from the bears. Ethan couldn't disagree. Whether placed by bears or by the forest itself, it was indeed a gift, a reminder that magic still existed for those who knew how to see it. The years continued to pass, seasons cycling through their eternal rhythm. Ethan retired from the fire service but remained connected to the station, volunteering and training new recruits. He would sometimes share the story of the bears, carefully, only with those he sensed would understand. Most would smile politely, assuming it was embellished or metaphorical. But occasionally, someone would lean in, eyes bright with recognition, and share their own impossible story of connection across species boundaries. These became Ethan's favorite moments, confirmation that what he'd experienced wasn't unique, but part of a larger pattern most people never noticed. Jacob's research continued to push boundaries, documenting behaviors and intelligence in bears that challenged conventional understanding. He discovered that bears could recognize individual humans even after years of separation, that mothers taught their cubs complex information about human behavior, that they had what could only be described as culture, passed down through generations. Each paper he published, each conference presentation he gave, was grounded in that night in the fire station, though he never said so publicly. But Ethan knew, and Jacob knew he knew, and that was enough. The fire station equipment room remained a place of quiet mystery. New firefighters would occasionally report odd feelings in the room, a sense of being watched or a strange warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Animals in distress seemed to find their way to the station more often than statistical probability would suggest. Injured birds would appear on windowsills, lost dogs would show up at the bay doors, and once, memorably, an orphaned fox kit was discovered curled up in the cab of Engine 4. Each time, the firefighters would care for the animal until proper help arrived, continuing a tradition they didn't fully understand but honored nonetheless. Ethan's granddaughter grew up to become a veterinarian, specializing in wildlife rehabilitation. She would often work with her father on research projects, bringing medical expertise to complement his behavioral studies. The wooden charm, now polished to a deep patina by 3 generations of handling, hung in her clinic. When particularly difficult cases came in, animals too traumatized or injured to trust humans, she would hold the charm and remember her grandfather's story. More often than not, she would find a way to reach the animal, to establish the same kind of impossible trust her grandfather had experienced that night. One day, reviewing trail camera footage from one of Jacob's research sites, they discovered something extraordinary. A bear, clearly elderly from its graying muzzle and careful movements, approaching a fire station in a town 50 miles from Millbrook. The bear circled the building once, seemed to examine the doors and windows, then disappeared back into the forest. When they checked the station's records, they found a report from that night. Strange noises in their equipment room, though nothing was found when they investigated. The pattern was spreading, or perhaps it had always existed, waiting for humans to notice and understand. Ethan lived to see his great-grandchildren born, twins who seemed to have inherited the family gift with animals. Even as infants, they would calm in the presence of creatures that should have frightened them. Birds would land unusually close when they were in their strollers. Squirrels would approach without fear, and once, during a family picnic, a deer had walked right up to their blanket. sniffed the babies gently, then walked away. Each incident was small, explainable by coincidence or habituation, but taken together they suggested something more: a recognition, a marking, a blessing passed down from that night when boundaries were crossed. The original wooden charm was eventually donated to a natural history museum, along with Jacob's research and Ethan's written account of that night. It was displayed in a section about human-wildlife interactions, though the full story was considered too extraordinary for the official description. But those who knew how to look could see the truth in the careful carving, the worn spots where 3 generations of fingers had rubbed it for courage and connection. It had become a symbol of something larger than one family's experience, a testament to the possibilities that existed when humans remembered they were part of nature, not separate from it. On his 90th birthday, surrounded by family and friends at the fire station, Ethan told the story one last time. His voice was weaker now, but his memory of that night remained crystal clear. He spoke of Jacob's innocent courage, the mother bear's desperate trust, the cub's playful spirit, and the profound connection that had changed all their lives. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the skeptics were moved by the conviction in his voice, the detail of his memory, the love with which he spoke of that impossible encounter. That night, after everyone had gone home, Ethan sat alone in the equipment room. It had been renovated several times over the years, but he could still see it as it had been that night. The frightened cub in the corner, Jacob's small hand extended in friendship, the beginning of something extraordinary. He closed his eyes and could almost feel the weight of the mother bear's paw in his hands again, the trust she had placed in him, the gift she had given them all. When he opened his eyes, there on the floor in front of him was a single black bear hair, impossible but undeniable. He picked it up carefully, this final gift, this last confirmation that it had all been real. Outside, he could hear the October wind in the trees, the same sound that had accompanied them into the forest that night. Somewhere out there, generations of bears carried the memory of human kindness. Somewhere out there, the connections continued. Invisible threads linking species in ways that science was only beginning to understand. The equipment room door was still locked, would always be locked, but Ethan knew now that some barriers were meant to be crossed. Some locks existed only to make the opening more meaningful. The story lives on in Millbrook, passed from parent to child, firefighter to rookie, generation to generation. Details may change in the telling. Embellishments creep in, skeptics dismiss it as legend. But those who have experienced their own moments of impossible connection know the truth of it. They know that sometimes, in the quiet spaces between human and wild, magic still happens. A mother's desperate love finds a way to save her child. A boy's innocent compassion bridges an ancient divide. A man's courage to trust his instincts changes the course of multiple lives. And somewhere, always, the bears remember. The fire station still stands at the edge of town, where civilization meets wilderness. The equipment room door still requires a special key. And sometimes, on autumn evenings when the wind is just right and the moon is rising over the pine trees, if you listen very carefully, you might hear something that doesn't quite belong. A soft scratching, a gentle whimper, an invitation to step beyond the ordinary and into a world where anything is possible. The firefighters who hear it now know what to do. They check the room, just in case, carrying with them the memory of a night when trust transcended species, when love found a way, when a small boy and a bear cub taught everyone watching that the boundaries we think separate us are not as solid as they seem. 2 chapters of mentioned part has completed. Looking at the wooden charm one last time before the museum sealed it in its climate-controlled case, Ethan's great-granddaughter noticed something she'd never seen before. In the right light, at just the right angle, the carved symbols seemed to form a picture. A human hand touching a bear's paw, surrounded by stars. It had been there all along, waiting for someone to see it, to understand its message. We are all connected, it seemed to say. We are all part of the same story, the same forest, the same family. The bears knew it. Jacob had known it instinctively. And now, finally, looking at that ancient carving, she knew it too. Lily Morgan had seen a lot in her 15 years as a wildlife expert, but nothing quite like what she was looking at now. She'd been called to the Millbrook Fire Station on what seemed like a routine consultation. A bear cub found in their equipment room, probably separated from its mother and seeking shelter. But standing in that room, looking at the cub being comforted by a 7-year-old boy, while his firefighter father explained the impossible circumstances of its appearance, she knew this was anything but routine. The cub was too calm, too purposeful in its behavior, and there was something about the way it kept looking at the door, as if waiting for something or someone. She knelt beside the cub, her trained eye taking in details others might miss. Its fur was well groomed, not matted or dirty as she'd expect from a lost cub. There was no sign of malnutrition beyond recent hunger, no injuries, no parasites. This cub had been well cared for until very recently. But it was the collar that made her hands tremble as she examined it. The weaving was intricate, deliberate, using plant fibers she recognized as coming from deep forest vegetation, plants that grew only in the oldest parts of the woods. No human had made this collar, she was certain. The pattern was too complex, too organic, too purposeful. The wooden charm attached to the collar was even more intriguing. The symbols carved into it weren't random. They had structure, repetition, almost like a language. She'd seen similar markings once before, years ago, on trees deep in the wilderness where no humans ventured. At the time, she'd dismissed them as coincidental scarring, but looking at this deliberate carving, she began to reconsider. "Mr. Marshall," she said slowly, still examining the charm, "I need you to tell me exactly how you found this cub. Every detail, no matter how strange it might seem." As Ethan recounted the story, the locked door, the impossible entry, the cub's strange calmness, Lily felt her understanding of the natural world shifting. She'd always believed animals were more intelligent than most people gave them credit for, but this suggested something beyond intelligence. This suggested planning, understanding of human systems, deliberate communication across species boundaries. The cub made a soft sound, drawing her attention. It was looking at her intently, those amber eyes holding an expression she could only describe as hopeful. It wanted something from her, needed her to understand something. "Has it shown any signs of wanting to leave?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jacob shook his head, his small hand still gently stroking the cub's fur. "He's waiting," the boy said with that matter-of-fact certainty children possessed. "He brought us somewhere we needed to go, and now he's waiting for something else." Lily looked at the boy more carefully. There was something different about him. A quality she'd seen in a few rare individuals who seemed to have a natural connection with animals. They didn't just observe animal behavior. They understood it on an intuitive level that couldn't be taught. She pulled out her phone and showed Ethan a map of the area. "Show me where the cub led you," she said. He traced the route with his finger, ending at a clearing about a half-mile into the forest. Lily knew that area. It was old-growth forest, protected land that had never been logged. The trees there were ancient, some hundreds of years old. It was exactly the kind of place where... She stopped herself. Where what? where bears might develop intelligence beyond what science recognized, where the boundaries between human and animal might be thinner. These weren't scientific thoughts, but looking at the evidence before her, she couldn't dismiss them. "I need to see the mother," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "If my theory is correct, she's still there, waiting." Ethan looked uncertain, but Jacob was already on his feet, ready to go. The cub stood too, that same expectant posture it had shown before. It knew, Lily realized. It understood their conversation, maybe not the words, but certainly the intent. This was unprecedented, the kind of observation that could change everything about how we understood animal cognition. But first, she needed to see the mother, needed to understand the full scope of what was happening here. The walk through the forest felt different with Lily along. She moved quietly, expertly, pointing out signs Ethan had missed on their first journey. Broken twigs at specific heights, scent markings on trees, subtle paths through the underbrush that suggested regular use. "This route has been used repeatedly," she whispered. "Not just by bears, by many animals. It's like a highway through the forest, but one that carefully avoids human trails." The implications of this made Ethan's head spin. Organized animal movement patterns that deliberately avoided human contact while still maintaining proximity to human structures. When they reached the clearing, the mother bear was exactly where Ethan had left her, though she stood when she saw them approaching. Her eyes went immediately to Lily, assessing this new human with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. Lily stopped at the edge of the clearing, her body language carefully neutral, non-threatening. She'd interacted with hundreds of bears over her career, but this felt different. This wasn't just an animal encounter. This was a meeting, a deliberate exchange between intelligences. The mother bear's injured paw was immediately apparent, the swelling visible even from a distance. But it was her behavior that fascinated Lily. The bear was waiting, watching, clearly evaluating whether this new human could be trusted. It was the kind of complex social calculation that primates were known for, but that bears weren't supposed to be capable of. Yet here it was, undeniable. The mother bear made a decision, limping forward a few steps, deliberately showing her injury to Lily, just as she had to Ethan and Jacob. "My God," Lily breathed, her scientific training warring with the evidence of her eyes. "She's presenting symptoms. She's literally showing me what's wrong." In 15 years of wildlife work, she'd never seen anything like it. Animals might tolerate treatment when injured, might even seek out human help in desperate situations, but this deliberate presentation of injury for diagnosis was something else entirely. It suggested not just intelligence, but understanding of human capability, knowledge that humans could provide medical help that bears couldn't manage themselves. Lily approached slowly, noting how the mother bear's posture changed, becoming less defensive as she got closer. The cub ran to its mother, making soft sounds that seemed almost like speech. And impossibly, the mother's expression seemed to soften, as if the cub was vouching for these humans. When Lily knelt beside the injured paw, the bear extended it toward her, just as Ethan had described. The trust required for this act was staggering. This bear was putting her life and her cub's life in the hands of a species that had historically been their greatest threat. Examining the wound, Lily could see that Ethan had done a good job with the initial treatment, but the infection needed proper antibiotics. She had some in her truck, veterinary-grade antibiotics she carried for emergency wildlife treatment. "I need to go back to my vehicle," she said softly, not sure if she was talking to the humans or the bear. "I have medicine that will help." The mother bear pulled her paw back, and settled into a resting position, clearly prepared to wait. The trust was absolute, patient, almost human in its quality. On the walk back to the station, Lily's mind raced with possibilities. If bears had this level of intelligence, if they could plan and communicate and trust to this degree, what else didn't we know about them? How many other species might possess intelligence we'd simply never recognized because we weren't looking for it in the right way? She thought about all the unexplained animal behaviors she'd witnessed over the years, things she'd dismissed as coincidence or anthropomorphism. What if she'd been wrong? What if animals had been trying to communicate with humans all along, and we'd just been too arrogant to listen? She prepared a syringe with antibiotics, added pain medication and anti-inflammatory drugs to her kit. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it right. The bear deserved the same level of care she'd give to any patient. Jacob watched her preparations with intense interest, asking questions about each medication, what it did, why it was needed. His understanding was remarkable for a 7-year-old, but more than that, he seemed to grasp the significance of what they were doing. They weren't just treating an injured animal, they were building a bridge between species. Back in the clearing, the mother bear was exactly where they'd left her, the cub playing nearby but always staying within sight. When Lily approached with the syringe, the bear tensed slightly. This was the critical moment. Would the bear allow an injection? It was one thing to tolerate quill removal and topical treatment, quite another to accept a needle. Lily held up the syringe, letting the bear see it, smell it. "This will help," she said, feeling slightly foolish talking to a bear but unable to stop herself. "It might sting for a moment, but it will fight the infection." What happened next challenged everything Lily thought she knew about animal behavior. The bear looked at the syringe, then at her cub, then back at Lily. Then, deliberately, she extended her injured leg and turned it to expose the muscle, the perfect injection site. She knew, somehow, she knew what was needed. Lily's hands shook slightly as she administered the injection. The bear flinched but didn't pull away, her eyes never leaving Lily's face. When it was done, the bear pulled her leg back and examined the injection site with what could only be described as curiosity. They stayed in the clearing for another hour, Lily observing and taking notes while Jacob played with the cub under the watchful eyes of both his father and the mother bear. The interaction between boy and cub was fascinating, neither showing fear, both seeming to understand the boundaries of their play instinctively. At one point, the cub got too rough, and the mother made a soft sound. The cub immediately gentled its play, and remarkably, Jacob seemed to understand too, adjusting his own behavior to match. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber, Lily realized she was witnessing something that might never be repeated. This wasn't just a wildlife encounter, it was a glimpse into a hidden world that existed parallel to human civilization. These bears weren't just animals living in the forest. They were beings with their own intelligence, their own culture, their own understanding of the world that included knowledge of humans and how to interact with them when necessary. The mother bear stood, testing her weight on the injured paw. The pain medication was clearly helping, and she moved more easily. She approached them, stopping just a few feet away. Then she did something that would haunt Lily's dreams for years to come. She sat up on her haunches, bringing her to roughly human height, and placed one massive paw over her heart, then extended it toward them. It was unmistakably a gesture of gratitude, too deliberate and human-like to be anything else. But bears didn't make gestures like that. They couldn't. It was anatomically improbable and behaviorally impossible. Yet she had just seen it. Jacob stepped forward and, without fear, placed his small hand on the bear's extended paw. For a moment, boy and bear stayed frozen in that position, and Lily felt she was witnessing something ancient, a connection that predated civilization, when humans and animals shared the world more equally. Then the moment broke. The bear dropped to all fours, collected her cub with a gentle nudge, and began walking deeper into the forest. At the edge of the clearing, she looked back once, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn, then disappeared into the gathering darkness. The walk back to the station was quiet, each of them processing what they'd experienced. Lily's scientific mind was already racing with questions, theories, implications. But another part of her, a part she usually kept firmly suppressed in her professional life, was simply in awe. She had touched something magical, something that transcended scientific understanding. She had been trusted by a wild creature in a way that should have been impossible, and the trust had changed her fundamentally. At the station, she helped Ethan craft a report that would satisfy official requirements without revealing the full truth. A bear cub had been found in the station, likely entered through an open door someone forgot to close. It had been reunited with its mother without incident. No need to mention the locked room, the collar, the medical treatment, or the impossible intelligence they'd witnessed. Some truths, Lily was learning, were too large for official reports. They needed to be protected, kept safe from those who might exploit or destroy them in the name of science or safety. Before leaving, she knelt beside Jacob. "You have a gift," she told him seriously. "The way you connected with that cub, the way you understood what was needed. Don't ever lose that." The boy nodded solemnly, his hand going to the wooden charm his father had removed from the collar and given to him. "They'll come back," he said with quiet certainty. "Maybe not them exactly, but others like them. They know we're here now. They know we'll help." Lily wanted to say that wasn't how the world worked, that wild animals didn't form lasting connections with humans, but after what she'd witnessed, she couldn't bring herself to contradict him. Over the following weeks, Lily found herself returning to the clearing regularly. She never saw the bears again, but she found evidence of their presence. Tracks that suggested the mother's paw was healing well, marking on trees that seemed deliberate, even what looked like gifts left at the base of the ancient oak. Unusual stones and perfect feathers arranged too carefully to be accidental. She documented everything, building a file that she knew she could never publish but couldn't stop herself from creating. She also began researching, diving deep into historical accounts, indigenous stories, folklore from around the world. Again and again, she found tales of bears displaying impossible intelligence, of connections between humans and bears that transcended normal animal behavior. Stories she had once dismissed as mythology now seemed like glimpses of a truth that modern science had forgotten or ignored. What if humans and certain animals had always been capable of this connection, but modern life had severed it, made us forget that we were once part of a larger conversation? 3 weeks after the initial encounter, Lily was called to another unusual situation. A bear had been spotted near the elementary school, causing panic among parents and staff. But when she arrived, she found the bear sitting calmly at the edge of the playground, making no aggressive moves, just watching. It was a young male, probably 3 years old, with a distinctive white patch on his chest. As she approached, the bear stood and began walking away, but slowly, looking back repeatedly as if asking her to follow. Against all protocol, she followed. The bear led her to a drainage ditch where she found what he'd apparently wanted her to see. A small dog, someone's pet, trapped in a storm drain, too deep for it to climb out. The bear sat and watched as Lily called for help and coordinated the rescue. When the dog was finally pulled out, muddy but unharmed, the bear stood, looked at her for a long moment, then disappeared into the woods. The dog's collar had a phone number, and when the grateful owner arrived, they mentioned their dog had been missing for 2 days. 2 days, the bear had apparently been trying to get human help. She called Ethan that night, needing to talk to someone who would understand. "It's spreading," she said without preamble. Or maybe it was always there and we're just starting to see it. He understood immediately, telling her about similar incidents he'd been hearing about from other firefighters, other first responders. Animals seeking human help in unprecedented ways, displaying intelligence and communication abilities that challenged everything they thought they knew. It was as if the bears from that night had opened a door, shown both species that communication was possible, and now others were walking through it. Lily began networking quietly with others who'd had similar experiences. Wildlife biologists who'd observed impossible behaviors, veterinarians who'd treated animals that seemed to understand what was happening to them, even ordinary people who'd had encounters they couldn't explain. A hidden community formed, sharing stories and evidence, building a body of knowledge that existed outside official channels. They called themselves the Bridge Builders, people who had witnessed and facilitated connections between human and animal worlds. The implications were staggering. If animals possessed this level of intelligence, if they could communicate and plan and trust, then humanity's entire relationship with the natural world needed to be reconsidered. Laws, ethics, conservation efforts, everything would need to change. But change would be slow, Lily knew. People weren't ready to accept that animals might be more than resources or pets or wildlife to be managed. The bridge would have to be built slowly, one connection at a time, one story at a time. She developed new protocols for wildlife interaction, methods that acknowledged animal intelligence and agency. Instead of capture and relocation, she began trying communication and negotiation. It didn't always work, but when it did, the results were remarkable. Bears that understood boundaries and respected them, wolves that warned hikers away from dangerous areas, even a mountain lion that led rescuers to an injured hiker. Each incident was explained away by officials as coincidence or instinct, but those who witnessed them knew better. Jacob visited her office one day, now a teenager but still carrying that same quiet confidence with animals. He was volunteering at her wildlife rehabilitation center, and his gift had only grown stronger. Animals that were terrified of other humans would calm in his presence, would allow treatment they'd fight against with anyone else. He told her about his plans to study wildlife biology, to follow in her footsteps but go further, to prove scientifically what they both knew intuitively, that the barrier between human and animal consciousness was far thinner than anyone imagined. The bears that night, he said, they didn't just come for help, they came to teach us something. To show us that we've been wrong about them, about all of them. They trusted us with their lives to prove that trust was possible. Lily nodded, thinking of all the connections she'd witnessed since that night, all the bridges built between species. Jacob was right. The bears had been teachers, showing both species a better way forward, a future where humans and animals could coexist, not just peacefully but cooperatively. Years passed, and Lily became known as the wildlife expert who got results no one else could achieve. Problem bears that would have been destroyed were successfully relocated after she somehow negotiated with them. Injured animals recovered at rates that defied medical explanation. Human-wildlife conflicts decreased in areas where she worked, though no one could quite explain why. She never spoke publicly about her methods, knowing they would be dismissed or ridiculed. But quietly, patiently, she continued building bridges. One spring morning, nearly a decade after that first encounter, Lily received a call that brought everything full circle. A bear had been hit by a car on the highway near Millbrook, badly injured, but still alive. When she arrived, she found a crowd gathered at a safe distance, watching something unprecedented. Another bear, a large male, was standing guard over the injured animal, clearly protecting it but making no aggressive moves toward the humans. As Lily approached, the guardian bear looked at her, and she saw recognition in its eyes. The injured bear was female, middle-aged, with distinctive scarring on her left paw that looked like old puncture wounds, fully healed, but leaving a unique pattern. Lily's breath caught. It couldn't be the same bear, could it? But as she knelt beside the injured animal, she saw the intelligence in those amber eyes, the same trust she'd witnessed years ago. The bear was badly hurt, internal injuries that would require surgery, but she was conscious, aware, and she recognized Lily. She was certain of it. The male bear stepped back, allowing Lily and her team to work. They stabilized the injured bear and transported her to the veterinary hospital, the male following the ambulance for several miles before disappearing into the forest. The surgery was complex, touch and go for a while, but the bear pulled through. During her recovery, she displayed the same remarkable understanding she'd shown years ago, cooperating with treatment, taking medication without resistance, even seeming to understand when Lily explained what was happening to her. Local news picked up the story of the bear that survived against all odds, but they missed the real story. They missed the way other bears came to the edge of the forest near the rehabilitation facility, checking on their injured family member. They missed the way the recovering bear would go to the window at specific times, as if keeping appointments with her visitors. They missed the profound communication happening between species, the bridges being strengthened with each passing day. When the bear was finally ready for release, half the town turned out to watch. Lily had chosen the clearing, that same ancient oak where it had all begun. As the transport cage was opened, the bear emerged slowly, testing her rebuilt strength. She stood for a moment, surveying the crowd, then did something that made the local news and went viral on social media, though no one could quite explain it. She walked directly to Jacob, now a young man pursuing his doctorate, and placed her paw gently on his chest, right over his heart. Then she turned to Lily and did the same. Finally, she walked to Ethan, now gray-haired but still strong, and repeated the gesture. Then she was gone, disappearing into the forest with a grace that belied her recent ordeal. The crowd dispersed, chattering excitedly about what they'd witnessed, but Lily, Ethan, and Jacob remained in the clearing. They understood what others didn't. They had been marked, recognized, thanked. The bridge they'd helped build that night so many years ago was now strong enough to bear the weight of a new understanding between species. The bears had kept their promise, returning when they needed help, trusting the humans who had first trusted them. That night, Lily added a final entry to her unofficial file on interspecies communication. The circle is complete. What began with a mother's desperate trust has become a network of understanding that spans generations and species. We are not alone in our intelligence, our emotions, our capacity for connection. We share this world with beings who think, feel, and remember. The bears have taught us this. Now it's our responsibility to remember, to protect, and to continue building bridges. The work is not finished. In truth, it has only just begun. She thought about the injured bear recovering out there in the forest, thought about her cub from all those years ago, now grown and perhaps with cubs of its own. The wooden charm that had started it all was now in a museum, but its message lived on in every connection made, every bridge built, every moment of trust between species. The world was changing, slowly but inevitably, toward a future where humans recognize their place not as masters of nature, but as participants in a larger community of consciousness. The fire station in Millbrook still stands, the equipment room still locked with that same old key. But now it's known as a safe place, not just for humans but for any creature in need. The firefighters have all heard the story, and whether they believe it or not, they keep their eyes open for animals seeking help. More often than you might expect, they find them. And when they do, they remember the lesson of that October night. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust. Sometimes the most important connections are the most unexpected, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to be part of building a bridge between worlds. Lily often thinks about that first night, about the courage it took for that mother bear to trust her cub to humans, about the wisdom of a 7-year-old boy who saw no barriers between species, about a firefighter who chose compassion over protocol. It had been the beginning of something beautiful and strange and important. The bears had known something humans had forgotten, that we are all part of the same story, all connected in ways we're only beginning to understand. They had been patient teachers, waiting for humans to remember how to listen. Now, as she watches the next generation of wildlife biologists and conservationists, she sees that understanding spreading. Young scientists who don't dismiss animal intelligence, who look for communication rather than assuming its absence, who approach wildlife with respect rather than superiority. The bridges are multiplying, strengthening, becoming permanent fixtures in the landscape of human-animal interaction. What started with one desperate mother bear and one compassionate boy has become a movement, quiet but powerful, changing the world one connection at a time. The bears are still out there, living their lives in the forest, raising their cubs, finding food, preparing for winter. But now they know, as humans are learning, that the boundary between their world and ours is not a wall but a bridge. And bridges, as any engineer will tell you, are meant to be crossed. The mother bear's desperate gamble that October night had paid off in ways she probably never imagined. She had not just saved her cub, she had opened a door to a future where humans and animals could meet as equals, where trust could transcend species, where love and compassion could bridge any gap. As Lily closes her file for the night, she hears something outside her window. A soft scratching, a gentle whimper, sounds that don't quite belong. She smiles, knowing what she'll find when she investigates. Another animal seeking help, another opportunity to strengthen the bridge, another chapter in the ongoing story of connection between worlds. The bears had started it, but now it belongs to all of them. Every creature brave enough to reach across the divide and trust in the possibility of understanding.